Welcome to Wisp Tales. Tonight, the audacious rise of Walt Disney, the kid with a sketchbook who turned setbacks into a kingdom and a mouse into magic. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a blueprint, rejections, near bankruptcy, and the stubborn imagination that wouldn't quit. He was the kid who drew on scrap paper and the backs of envelopes, the one who stayed up late copying cartoons from the newspaper while everyone else slept. He delivered papers before dawn, sketchbook tucked under his arm, and learned early what it felt like to be tired and keep going anyway. As a teenager, he lied about his age to drive an ambulance overseas, painting little cartoons on the side panels to make strangers smile. He came home with a habit he'd never quit. When life got loud, he drew until it made sense. He found work in a little ad shop, learning the clack and hum of early animation, camera stands cobbled together, celluloid sheets that stuck to your fingers, stop-motion patience. By day, he made commercials with dancing toothpaste and cheerful hot dogs. By night, he sketched stories that wanted bigger rooms. He pulled friends into the idea, rented a tiny office that smelled like dust and coffee, and painted the name on the door himself. Laughogram Films sounded like a promise. The promise met rent. The stories were charming, the invoices were not. Checks arrived late, bills arrived on time. He kept the studio alive with optimism and credit until optimism couldn't keep the lights on. One by one, the desks emptied. He fed himself on cans of beans and the belief that the next reel would change everything. It didn't. He folded the company, packed a cardboard suitcase, and bought a one-way train ticket west, with a few drawings, a second-hand suit, and a stubborn idea that he hadn't failed, he'd just finished a rough draft. He arrived in California with $20 and a cardboard suitcase that squeaked when the handle turned. Los Angeles felt like a dare, sun on everything, studio gates like fortresses. He crashed on his brother's Roy's couch and pitched big studios on small cartoons. Nobody bit. So he flipped the script. If the doors wouldn't open, he'd make a door. In the back of a rented garage, he set up a camera on a stack of crates and wrote a letter that sounded braver than he felt to a New York film distributor. The reply blinked across a telegram. Interested. He didn't have a team. He found one. He coaxed Iworks, the quiet genius he'd worked with back in Kansas City, to come west. He shot a wild hybrid series, live-action girl animated world, called the Alice Comedies, stealing time from sleep and light from the window. Roy kept the books, steady as a drumbeat. They mailed reels east and waited for news like weather. It came. Send more. So the garage became a studio, the postcard dream became an address, and a pair of brothers who could have folded, instead, decided to double down. The first big hit wore long ears. He and drew a cheerful rabbit named Oswald, and audiences loved him. Rubber hose limbs, a grin that bounced. The distributor cheered, theaters booked more reels, and the studio felt for a minute safe. He took a train to New York, certain he'd negotiate better terms and come home a conquering hero. In a spare office with a too-clean desk, the distributor smiled the way people smile before they say something that will bruise you. The contract had a clause he'd skimmed when he was hungry and hopeful. Oswald wasn't his. While he'd been sleeping on ambition, The distributor had quietly hired away most of his animators with a few extra dollars and the promise of stability.
"We'll keep the rabbit," the man said kindly, as if kindness could make it less sharp. "You can stay on at a lower rate. Or not." He shook hands, because his parents had raised him to be polite even when he wanted to flip the table. Then he walked out, bought a ticket west, and boarded a train with nothing in his pockets except a return stub and a refusal to be finished. Somewhere in the clatter between New York and Los Angeles, the loss turned into a sketch. He filled a notebook with circles, one big, two small. A creature that could survive contracts and theft and the kind of naivete that gets eaten in meetings. He showed the drawing to Lillian, who looked past the pencil lines and into the intent. "Mortimer," he said, testing the name. She wrinkled her nose. "Too stuffy," she smiled. "Call him Mickey." By the time the train pulled into the station, the mouse had a personality, a tempo, a kind of optimism that felt like armor. They went back to the garage spirit, late nights, fresh coffee, Oob's clean lines, and taught Mickey to move. Then they did something wilder. They taught him to talk, or rather to sync his world to sound. Everyone said sound was a gimmick, that it would pass, that it was too expensive and audiences didn't care. He bet the studio on the opposite. In a small theater, the lights went down and Steamboat Willie flickered to life. The whistle tooted in time, the gags landed with percussion, and for the first time, people didn't just watch a cartoon, they heard it breathe. The laughter was louder than money. It sounded like a door opening that no claws could close. The mouse opened the door, but he wanted more than a doorway. He wanted a whole hallway of invention. While Mickey packed theaters, he and the team built a playground for experiments. The shorts that let them try risky ideas without risking the studio. They played with timing first, then music itself. Not just background, but spine. In one, a skeleton dance ticked and rattled like a drum line. In another, raindrops became instruments. Barnyard tools turned into a band. They named the series with a grin. Silly Symphonies. Because the point was joy, and also because Laboratory of Narrative Techniques didn't look good on a title card. Money was still tight. Critics still sniffed at cartoons, and rivals copied fast. So he went where rivals wouldn't spend. Color. The new Technicolor process was expensive, temperamental, and brighter than anything audiences had seen. He signed an exclusive deal for cartoons. Costly, controversial, and exactly the kind of bet he liked. When flowers and trees bloomed on screen, leaves flashed green like they were lit from inside, and fire glowed with a heat people swore they could feel from their seats. For the first time, a cartoon won an Academy Award. It wasn't the statue that mattered, it was the signal. To his crew, to investors, to every kid with a pencil, that animation could carry emotion the way an actor's face did. They pushed farther. The Three Little Pigs landed in the middle of a hard year, and audiences hummed a simple tune, "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?" like a charm against worry. People stood in lobbies whistling, smiling at strangers. He noticed the way a song could leave the theater with you and make the story last until morning. He noticed, too, that the joy was a bridge to something bigger than gags, feeling.
If a short could make a room full of tired people feel braver by the time the lights came up, maybe a longer story could do more than anyone expected from drawings. Between sessions, he walked the halls, peeking over shoulders, asking for one more try on a blink, a shrug, a laugh. He bought a little farm, not for status, but for distance, a place to think in straight lines while riding a horse, a place to imagine what kinds of worlds could live on film next. At night, he filled notebooks with ambitious nonsense and circled one phrase until the page looked worn: feature length. Everyone said it wouldn't work. Children would fidget, adults would sneer, bankers would refuse. He sharpened his pencil and started planning anyway. They called it a folly before it had a frame. A feature-length cartoon? Children would squirm, adults would roll their eyes, and the bank would say no in a tone that felt personal. He nodded, smiled, and mortgaged the future anyway. His house, the studio, his sleep. He hired more artists than his payroll could politely carry and turned the place into a school. Drafting rooms became classrooms. Animators studied anatomy and acting, watched dancers for weight and grace, practiced making a character think before it moved. He brought in mirrors, filmed live-action reference, and said a sentence that sounded simple and cost years. Make me believe. Snow White wasn't just drawings. She needed warmth in her cheeks and breath between her lines. He chased a voice until he found one that fell like glass chimes and felt human. The dwarfs got rhythms as distinct as fingerprints. The queen's transformation had to crawl under your skin. Backgrounds deepened into forests that seemed to fog at the edges. To make the camera drift through painted space, the team built a strange tower of glass and lights, the multi-plane rig, so layers could slide past each other like a dream you remembered perfectly. Bills piled higher than storyboards. He screened rough sequences for bankers who blinked at the unfinished faces and couldn't see the finished feeling. He screened for his crew in the late hours and asked for one more pass on a glance, a shrug, a smile that didn't quite land. He was relentless, but the relentlessness pointed at wonder, not just polish. The night of the premiere, the theater glowed like a ship. He sat with a knot in his stomach and watched a room forget itself. Grown men leaned forward, children went quiet, and when the dwarfs cried, so did people who hadn't planned to. At the end, the applause didn't sound like manners. It sounded like relief. The papers in the morning stopped saying folly. The box office stopped saying maybe. Awards showed up. One big Oscar and 7 small ones, a joke that felt like a thank you. But what mattered lived in the eyes of anyone who'd ever been told a drawing couldn't hold a heartbeat. He walked the lot the next day, pockets still mostly empty, but future suddenly crowded. If a story drawn by hand could make a world you could live in for an hour and not want to leave, what else could fit on a sheet of paper? Success didn't make him cautious, it made him braver. He greenlit one ambitious picture after another, carved puppets that wanted to be real, a sorcerer's apprentice chasing living music, a faun learning the geometry of danger. He pushed craft to the edge, richer shadows, water that looked cold, smoke that curled like it knew where it was going.
Reduce noise. Audiences marveled. Ledgers worried. Perfection ate time. Time ate money. Then the world tilted. Resources shifted. Shipments stalled, and the studio swapped fairy tale forests for training reels, newsreels, and shorts that served a larger fight. Payroll stayed alive on contracts, not magic. The staff grew, then chafed. Long hours and tight budgets turned whispers into a walkout that stretched for weeks.
He drove past the picket signs every morning, proud and hurt at once, learning in real time that building a dream also meant building a workplace, with pay scales, credit lines, and voices that wanted to be heard. When the smoke cleared, the studio was different, leaner, older, a little scarred. So was he. But the pencil still fit his hand. He started looking for new canvases where imagination and cash flow could get along. Places where a story didn't have to wait on film stock to change someone's day. Television looked like a toy to most filmmakers. He saw a lifeline and a megaphone. While rivals sniffed, he walked into a network office with two ideas that sounded like one. A weekly show that fed the national imagination, and a place in the real world where that imagination had an address. He sketched it on napkins and legal pads. A clean, safe park where parents wouldn't dread the sidewalks, where stories had streets and music had corners. To buy land without inviting stampede prices, he used quiet companies with quiet names, and drove orange groves on weekends, counting freeway exits and dreaming in ride layouts. Anaheim didn't know it was about to become a noun. Banks winced at the cost. The network didn't. A deal was struck. He'd make television that made kids beg to visit, and the network would help finance the visit. Construction looked impossible until it looked inevitable. Steel rising from dirt, carpenters turning paint into nostalgia, engineers learning to hide machinery inside magic. He walked the site in a hard hat and a tie, pockets full of notes and cigarettes he kept forgetting to smoke. When crews ran late, he ran with them. When a detail wasn't right, he made it right, even if it meant ripping up a sidewalk after sunset.
Opening day arrived hot and messy. Asphalt softened in the sun, a shoe got stuck, counterfeit tickets flooded the gates, rides hiccuped, cameras missed cues. The press whispered, "Disaster." But when the sun dropped and the lights came up, Main Street glowed like a memory you could walk through. Kids pulled parents by the hand. Strangers smiled at each other for no reason except that the air felt like a story you could breathe. By week 2, the lines made their own weather. He stood in the shadows one evening and watched a little girl meet a mouse that used to be circles in a notebook. Her face did something you'd mortgage a studio to see twice. He didn't say anything grand. He made a note about trash cans every 30 feet and the exact pace of the parade. The studio needed a second first act. Post-war bills were loud, and features were a gamble again. He chose a story everyone knew and no one had yet seen move like this. A girl, a clock, a chance. Cinderella wasn't just pretty, she was a financial lifeline. If audiences came, the studio lived. They came. The glass slipper fit, debt eased, and the gates opened for Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, widescreen dogs, spaghetti-like choreography, and a hand-painted cathedral called Sleeping Beauty that nearly broke the budget and still glows like stained glass.
Between films, he invented new toys, audio animatronics, figures that breathed and blinked on cue, so a story could look you in the eye. He folded engineers and artists into one word, Imagineers, and told them to make feelings mechanical and machines emotional. In the workshop, you could hear hammers and humming at the same time.
Television brought families to the same couch. He wanted a film that could do the same in a theater. He wrestled for years with a story about a no-nonsense nanny and a house that needed wonder. When the author finally said yes, he built a world where live actors danced with drawings, where chimney sweeps tapped across rooftops and a chalk sidewalk opened like a portal. The set was a factory for impossible shots, wires hidden in seams, cameras gliding through painted skies, animators matching frames to footsteps so precisely the seams turned into sparkle. When the curtain fell on Mary Poppins, the songs followed people home. Awards came in armfuls, but what he treasured was the sight of 3 generations in the same row humming the same tune. Around the same time, he treated the 1964 World's Fair like a laboratory with a global audience. He sent teams to build moving, speaking figures that didn't just jerk, they breathed. A president rose and addressed a room. A family's future spun on a turntable of gadgets and hope. Children floated past dolls that sang in dozens of languages about one small world. When the fair closed, he packed the ideas in crates and drove them home to the park, where they kept singing and never really stopped. He wasn't collecting tricks. He was stockpiling proof that imagination could be engineered, reliable as a timetable, repeatable as sunrise. He started looking at a map with a builder's eye. Traffic patterns, weather, the way land met sky. If one park could prove an idea, 2 could prove a philosophy. He flew over swamps and cattle fields and saw not what was there, but what could be. A resort that hid its roads, a backstage so clean the onstage could be spotless. A place big enough to keep the magic from being crowded out. To keep prices sane, he bought parcels quietly through shell companies with names that sounded like neighbors. Piece by piece, the puzzle filled in. He didn't just want a second park, he wanted a prototype city, a living showroom for better ways to move, to work, to keep a place safe and beautiful. He drew a wheel with neighborhoods radiating from a center hub and wrote letters around it, EPCOT. He filmed a presentation that wasn't a pitch so much as a promise. Here's how people might live if we design for their best selves. Trains that glide, trash that disappears, weatherproof sidewalks, a downtown that belongs to feet more than fenders.
Then came the diagnosis that shortened every timeline. He kept working, because that's what he knew how to do. He met with engineers, sketched at a bedside tray, talked about sightlines and waterways, and how a guest should never have to see a service door. He didn't make a farewell speech. He left blueprints. When he was gone, the studio felt colder, and all those plans felt heavier. His brother looked at the maps and made a decision that was half grief and half grit. Finish it. The first phase would be the park, castles and riverboats, rails circling a promise, and then when the world had seen it work, they'd keep building toward the rest. On opening day, the gates swung wide. Families walked under a train station into a street that smelled like fresh paint and popcorn, and somewhere, hidden below, the utilities moved like clockwork, just the way he wanted. Epcot didn't become the city he imagined. Pieces of it did, transport systems that floated and glided, backstage magic that kept the show seamless, a later park that became a world tour of possibility. The idea was too big to fit one for one. It seeped into everything instead, the way cues bent, the way buildings disguised their backs, the way a place could teach by delight. Years kept passing. New films learned from old films, new rides learned from old rides, and the mouse he drew on a train kept learning to say something new without forgetting how to wave. What survived wasn't just a brand, it was a method. Dream until it sounds unreasonable. Then build it so well the world wonders why it ever sounded hard. He built with blueprints. He led with taste. He'd walk a set or a street and spot the inch that didn't belong, the shade of yellow that read wrong at noon, the marquee letter hung a hair too low. He called landmarks weenies, jokes that were directions, towers and castles that tugged you forward without a map. He made buildings taller by making windows smaller as they climbed, forced perspective as hospitality. In reviews, people wrote about magic. In meetings, he talked about trash cans every 30 feet. He hired animators and turned them into mentors, the 9 old men, and built a studio where the critique was sharp but aimed at the work, not the person. On story days, he'd circle a problem until a solution felt inevitable. On bad days, he'd order everything torn out and start it again, because good enough wasn't a place you could live. He kept 2 lists in his head, what delighted a 5-year-old and what didn't insult their grandparent. He didn't chase trends, he chased timeless. When an idea failed, he folded the lesson into the next try, not the grievance.
He said plus it so often, it became a verb. People thought the secret was a mouse. The secret was a standard. He learned to braid stories into a loop that fed itself. A short on Sunday night made a child beg on Monday for a lunchbox that made the parent plan a summer trip, that sold a soundtrack that sent the family back to the couch for the next Sunday night. He didn't call it synergy, he just built it. Television episodes that teased a ride before it existed. A park parade that hummed a tune from a film still in pencils. A mouse ear silhouette that turned into a passport between mediums. The Mickey Mouse Club wasn't only a show, it was a classroom for loyalty. Davy Crockett was a frontier hat and a hit song and a suddenly crowded toy aisle. He licensed carefully, protected the brand like a family name, and taught a business to treat delight as an asset on a balance sheet. When copycats chased the logos, they missed the engine. Every part sold every other part because the parts were built to belong to each other. He believed stories got better in hot rooms. They called it the sweat box. Tiny screening rooms where rough scenes played and the air felt thick with nerves. He'd sit in the dark, a pencil tapping his teeth, and stop the reel mid-breath. What does he want in this frame, he'd ask. Why do I care on this cut? The questions sounded simple until you tried to answer them. When a gag didn't land, he didn't blame the audience, he blamed the clarity. If they didn't laugh, we didn't aim it right. He hired for talent and taught for taste. New animators started on hands and feet, learned to put weight in a step before they were allowed a face with feelings. Story artists pitched on their feet with paper pinned to cork, acting out scenes until a room full of peers grinned or winced. Draft after draft, the film shed cleverness that didn't serve the heartbeat. He'd push, then pull back. You've got something, he'd say, but it's hiding behind the business. Find the truth and throw the rest away. There was a second chair in every decision, Roy's. Where he saw the world that could be, Roy saw the numbers that had to add up to keep the doors open tomorrow. They argued like brothers and finished each other's sentences like partners. Deals got signed because Roy could stand in a banker's office and make risk look responsible.
Dreams got greenlit because Walt could stand at a corkboard and make numbers feel like nonsense compared to wonder. The company moved forward because neither man ever won entirely. He didn't coddle. He also didn't abandon. When a young animator cracked under pressure, he moved him to easier scenes until his hands caught up to his eye. When a director lost the thread, he took the reel for a week, found the spine, then gave it back with a map, not a scar. The work was the star. Credits rolled with names the public didn't know yet and would, because he made sure studio legends were built from inside out.
Reduce noise. On Friday evenings, he'd walk past the stages and the inking rooms and say goodnight like a foreman, eyes catching some small fix no one else would see until it was too late. He wasn't chasing perfection, he was protecting the feeling audiences carried out to their cars. He'd say it in a dozen ways, all meaning one thing. They paid with their time, give them more than they expected. Innovation kept the lights on as much as applause did. When costs threatened to drown hand-painted beauty, he bet on a new trick that looked like sacrilege to purists: xerography, a way to transfer animators' pencil lines straight to cells without armies of inkers redrawing every stroke. It gave 101 Dalmatians its scratchy, alive look and saved the studio from the math that was eating art. In the park, he treated concrete like a canvas and mountains like set pieces. A steel peak pierced the skyline, bobsleds dove through its ribs, and a sleek monorail slid above the streets like tomorrow humming. He walked guests past trash cans placed exactly where you'd realize you needed one, then stepped backstage to fuss over a hinge no one would see. He wasn't just making pictures or rides, he was building a machine where craft and practicality shook hands. Drawings that cost less but felt more. Transportation that thrilled and actually moved people. Details so precise they vanished into ease. He didn't plan a eulogy, he planned the next meeting. When he was gone, the studio felt like a house that had lost its heartbeat. But the blueprints were still warm. Roy, tired, steady, grieving, put on a suit and carried the plans like a promise. He walked the swampland that would become a kingdom, pointed where waterways should bend and where the trains should circle, and told every contractor the same thing: finish it the way he would have, down to the trash can spacing and the sight lines from a child's height. On opening week, the gate swung wide and the name on the arch said exactly what Roy insisted it should: Walt Disney World. Families streamed under the train tracks into a street perfumed with popcorn and paint, and a castle rose at the end like a story you already knew before you'd heard it. Roy stood beside a bronze statue of his brother and dedicated the place with a voice that wobbled once and then held. Cameras caught the spectacle. What mattered were the tiny decisions humming beneath. Utilities hidden in tunnels so the show never slipped. Gardeners.
Reduce noise. Swapping flowers overnight so seasons could turn in a single sleep. A flag lowered at dusk with quiet ceremony, as if the park itself took a breath. In a little window above the firehouse, a lamp glowed, left on as if he'd only stepped out for a walk. New animators learned from pencil tests he'd marked in grease pencil. New designers learned from notes that began with, "What will the guest feel here?" The company didn't survive because the mouse was cute. It survived because the method was contagious. Aim higher than the budget, then invent a way to make the budget behave. Protect the audience's time like a treasure. Plus it until it's effortless for them and exhausting for you. He loved trains before he could afford one. Not the kind that crossed the country, the kind that fit in a backyard and circled an orange tree like a promise. He laid rail behind his house, fired up a miniature steam engine, and invited friends to ride as it puffed past roses and laundry lines. The neighbors thought it was charming. He knew it was research. He studied joy at 5 miles per hour. How a bend should reveal a view, how a tunnel made you laugh because it made you a kid for 8 seconds. The backyard railroad didn't stay a hobby. It became the spine of a park where tracks framed lands, and a train whistle told you, without words, that you'd arrived somewhere safe to wonder. He treated curiosity like a calendar item. He'd vanish with a notepad and come back with pockets full of ideas, ticket stubs, brochures, sketches of rooflines and doorways. He studied how villages invited you down a lane, how shop windows pulled you in without shouting, how a bench in the right place made strangers linger. Back at the studio, he'd turn travel into taste. Textured plaster that felt like weather. Lanterns that glowed the way memory glows. Music that drifted just enough to make a street feel alive. When someone asked why a door handle mattered, he'd shrug and say, "Because a hand will feel it." He didn't copy places, he distilled them. Took the welcome and left the clutter. Took the charm and left the potholes. The result wasn't fake. It was concentrated real. He believed futures were built, not predicted. When he looked at the artists around him, he saw a pipeline that needed a school, not just a studio. He backed an idea that felt as audacious as a feature-length cartoon once did: gather painters, musicians, animators, actors, and designers under one roof and teach them to cross-pollinate. Not a finishing school, an engine. Scholarships, visiting masters, students learning draft by morning and staging by afternoon, critiquing each other until the work could stand up in any light.
He'd walk the halls and tell a violinist to sit in on a life drawing class, nudge an animator toward stagecraft so their characters knew how weight moves across a set. He wanted people who could see around corners, who understood that a good story lives at the intersection of disciplines. Years later, a generation with that DNA would pour back into the field. Directors with pencils in their pockets and theater in their bones, reviving features, reinventing shorts, and building parks that felt like films you could walk through. The credit lists got longer, the lineage stayed short. A stubborn belief that talent blooms when you teach it to listen sideways. Some bets didn't pay when the curtain fell. He made them anyway. He built an orchestra for pictures, music not as wallpaper but as the star, and wired a theater with a sound system no theater owned yet. The roadshow sparkled, receipts didn't. He shrugged and kept the reels. The world would catch up to stereo, and when it did, people would call it obvious. He wandered into the wild with a camera crew and came back with little epics, seasons as characters, animals as comedians, quiet as dialogue, teaching an audience to sit still for wonder without a single line of script. Some years the ledgers winced, some years they sang. He never confused today's box office with tomorrow's value. If the craft moved forward, the books could be argued with. If the craft stalled, nothing else mattered. He left behind a company that learned this too. Not every risk lands on opening weekend, but the right ones make opening weekends 2 decades from now. He never aimed for perfect, he aimed for alive. The work that lasted wasn't the prettiest frame. It was the moment you forgot you were looking at ink and paint and steel. He taught teams to chase that feeling,
to argue until the heart of a scene beat on its own, to throw away clever tricks that didn't serve wonder. The studio learned to treat curiosity like oxygen and change like a habit.
Decades later, new artists still sit in dark rooms, asking the same simple, brutal questions he asked in the sweatbox. What does this character want right now? Why should anyone care? The empire kept growing. New films, new lands, new ways to stitch music to motion and memory to place. And yet the center stayed small. A mouse with 2 circles for ears, a train that says welcome, a street that glows like a warm memory, a story that makes a stranger feel braver by the time the lights come up. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't magic. It was a method, repeated until it looked like magic. Dream bigger than is polite, build better than is necessary, and plus it until delight becomes the default. Some nights, a lamp in a window stays on above a little firehouse. People point and whisper. They take pictures. Then they look around and realize the real tribute isn't the lamp. It's the crowd smiling without knowing why, the kid tugging a parent toward a parade, the engineer straightening a hinge because a hand will feel it. That's the blueprint he left behind, a company that earns its miracles by caring about inches. Thanks for watching Wisped Tales. If Walt's journey lit a spark for you, tap like, subscribe and ring the bell. Next time, we'll bring another story you'll feel in your bones. Until then, keep building the thing only you can see and keep moving forward.